Welcome to Building Inclusive Digital Communities with Josh Hotzenpiller and Megan Martin. Discover how that human connection actually accelerates business objectives. Get ready to transform and grow.
Scott, it's so lovely to have you and joining us today to talk about community, inclusive communities. And really, I want to pick your brain a little bit more about your role and what you're doing. So first off, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and sort of your career in the DEI space?
Sure, my pleasure. And again, my name is Scott Blair, and currently I serve as the Senior Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Braun Medical of North America. I've been in this role only 3 months, actually. I think it's day like 100 or something like that. But my journey into this work, I think first starts on the personal side of things. I was born in Venezuela. I'm a person of color. Professionally, that's where I am now, and I think in a lot of ways it's because of my upbringing, what I've run into, my experiences being a person of color in America as a child, and then all the way through, of course, as a college student. But yeah, I've been doing the work of a chief diversity officer for a few years now. I was doing the work in higher education for a couple of institutions before I moved here to Braun this past spring.
Very cool. Well, talk to me a little. You've been working in the DEI space since about 2014 or so, which is somewhat unique because I think a lot of organizations are just now incorporating a chief diversity officer or something like that into their strategic plan and some of their leadership roles. What does that really mean? Like, talk to me about what kind of projects, what does day-to-day look like? What does a chief diversity officer focus on? What's their role in the organization?
Interesting when you asked that. I had a colleague share with me when I started in this position, Scott, you're the person of the people. And I think that's a good way to describe it, right? It's making connections with our community. And when I say community, in this case, we're talking about the company. And it includes, so then once I share that, let's define some things here, right? So diversity is acknowledging that there's variety in our community, whether it's gender, whether it's race, ethnicity, backgrounds, go down the list. I had a colleague of mine who does this work share with me, Scott, we are all unique. We all have our own fingerprint, for example. So having a one-size-fits-all approach to how we connect with one another doesn't make sense because of that uniqueness. And then that gets us to that word inclusion. And that's the work of creating those pathways of belonging and welcomeness. And what does that look like? So maybe it's employee resource groups in which we're bringing together communities of color and other identities. That's just one example, right?
Right.
Maybe looking at, are there any inequities in policies and procedures, dress codes, for example, and maybe the patriarchal structures that might exist in the dress code. It's looking at things like that can really minimize an individual's ability to be their full authentic self in the workplace environment, because the more you're connected and comfortable to be yourself, the more empowered you are to do the work.
Absolutely. No, I love that. And I think you touched on something that is really interesting of contextualizing what the word community means. So in your case, you're talking about company culture, people culture with your company. But when we're talking about community in general, sometimes that's externally, right? So you could have like a customer community, or like you said, an employee resource group would be sort of, would you consider that like a subset community of like the larger group? How do you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, not to cut you off. I think that's I think that's a good way to articulate that, yes, and how an employee resource group fits within the community structure of a company. And I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that, to not reference the fact that as a company, as a college and university prior to my time here at Braun, we cannot look at our organizations as if they exist in a vacuum, because we are a part of a larger ecosystem. Right. And in our case, right, for our corporate headquarters, we're here in the Lehigh Valley. So we need to think about that because, for example, as an employee, you may feel comfortable working 9 to 5 in the office, but if you go home and that same sense of belonging, welcomingness does not exist in the community that you live in, that of course is going to have an impact. If you have children, for example, and they are not having a favorable experience in the school district, that's
Right.
all a part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, I think you touch on a great point because I would say probably prior to maybe COVID, the pandemic, the word community a lot of times meant a geographic community. So like who's in your neighborhood, who's in your town. And I think, and why we're talking today is really talking about inclusive digital communities and what that really means. So when we add the word digital into this conversation, what does that look like for you? And in the age or lens of DEI, what does digital communities and how does that lend to some more inclusive environments for you?
I think it speaks to opportunities and challenges.
Okay.
So and when you share this, I think of an interesting exchange I had with a colleague of mine. At this point, it was about 2.5 years ago. And I was running some DEI related workshops and the individual came up to me and said, Scott, you ever give any thought to delivering these virtually? And this was pre-COVID. And I said, no, it needs to be in person, yada, yada, yada. Well, then COVID happened and we had to isolate. And I said, hold on a second, I got to think about how to do this. And actually what I found was, and not just me, many others too, is that there are some benefits here in the Hollywood Square that we're in, right? So we are in this new territory. And what are the opportunities? That we can connect with anyone within our company at just a click of a button, right? I work at a company in which we have, one, we're a global company, but our North American operations, where we have places and we have spaces in places like California, like Texas, like Florida, like St. Louis, Missouri. So in the past, I'd have to get on an airplane and go there. And we still want to do that because there's value in face-to-face, but now it's just a click. And hey, here we are talking. And in this case, we're doing that now, right? You're in Montana, I'm in Pennsylvania. So look at that, right? But then what are the challenges? And a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Sean Harper, recently noted in Forbes, he had an article just a couple of days ago talking about the virtual environment has actually helped professionals of color because we're not in the office now as much as we were before. And because of that, we're not experiencing the microaggressions and all the other things that maybe we experienced when we were in person, right? So those are some of the items where we need to kind of take a step back and ask the questions of, okay, what are the opportunities? What are the initiatives that we can build based on some of those experiences that we've had over the last 2 years?
Well, that's a great point and leads me sort of into my next question of having digital opportunities now, like we're doing right now here. How does that lend into your plan and your strategy and some of the projects that you work on, sort of as the people of the people, in building those communities and some of the initiatives you work on? How is this a part of your plan? Are you actively thinking about digital engagement for your community with the lens of making environments more inclusive? Or is this just a beautiful byproduct of all of the initiatives you're already doing?
The answer to that question is, how do you do this? It's yes, and you're going like this, right? You're shaking your head no, but saying yes at the same time, because it's complicated. I just had a call actually a little bit earlier with some colleagues speaking to the fact that, hey, not everyone has the access to technology in the way that maybe you and I do. So if everything's living on the web, everything's living virtually, if everything's living on Teams, maybe you have to connect to it with a specific internet connection. Well, if I don't have a company email address, if I'm an hourly employee, how do I connect with the material? So these are questions that I believe now that we are in this new space, if we don't have answers to it, that's okay, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore it either. So right? And I think that speaks to, okay, how can we become a little bit more innovative, recognizing that there are some benefits to this new mode of connecting with one another, while at the same time also acknowledging the value of being able to see each other, face to face, and some of those maybe nonverbals even that maybe a virtual engagement doesn't provide. So I hope I'm answering the question, but it's hard to answer it because there is so much uncertainty, because we are learning, and this is part of the equity work, right? Because sometimes, oh, hey, and then we make this assumptions that, okay, everyone's got a cell phone, everyone's got a laptop. Well, that's not the case. Maybe you have it, maybe you don't have a strong internet connection. And these are the things in which we need to be a little bit more nimble.
I thought about that a lot when a lot of the school systems went digital, and how many students, don't necessarily have a laptop or have an iPad or have internet connection to be able to participate with their other classmates, to that equity piece that you talk about. Right. And something else you touched on that I don't think it gets enough attention in this conversation of DEI and inclusion, but accessibility. When I think a lot, I have a visually impaired parent, and the way my dad navigates the world is very different, and the way he thinks about, and I have such a different appreciation when we're talking about inclusion and diversity from like an ADA standpoint as well. I don't know that we talk enough about that in this DEI space, and accessibility, to your point, is equally as important to that equity piece in DEI.
It is. And that's where, going back to one of your earlier questions about what does this work and what do you do? One of the very first things that I try to mobilize on is defining what these terms mean, because in that way it allows us to give grace and space to the number of different identities that we are looking to support, and accessibility is one of those. Now, and in doing so, we also need to acknowledge that there's a reason why race and gender, ethnicity are generally the first two things that come to mind.
Sure.
Because just the struggle of being humans over time, those are generally have been
they're also the most obvious, right?
And there's that too, right? Yeah. But that's part of telling the story of what is diversity and being able to recognize it's that, and we need to focus on those items, but it's also things such as accessibility. Let's do the work.
Yeah, for sure. And something else you touched on just here a second ago was the technology piece, and how can we leverage technology, one, in an equitable way. Like, just because someone has a cell phone doesn't necessarily mean they have the internet or the bandwidth to go and download all of these resources. As good of intentions are, how do you look at technology in this space and use it to achieve, the goals and initiatives you're trying to accomplish?
When you share that, there's something that and some of us have commented on this, of what's old is new again. And I remember there was a time just a couple of years ago where QR codes were a thing, right? They showed up for a hot minute and then they went away.
Yep.
And now they're back.
Except I'm with the boomers on this. I'm tired of reading menus on a QR code. I saw a meme about that and I was like, I totally get it. I want paper menus again.
I'm with you on that. It has provided, so, the company and previously at my former university and others, you look at things such as how, what is our access to technology and what are the devices that our people have, and may not have a laptop, but the vast majority of people do have some sort of a device, cellular device. Yeah. So what's the opportunity there, to your question, is, okay, you may not have the laptop to be able to sit down and do the work that's necessary in that way, but you have a cell phone. So if we can, for example, have some digital materials that we can put onto a website, things of that sort, and can provide a QR code, now you can take that cell phone, zap the QR code, that takes you to where you need to go. And now you have access to those materials. Without that, you wouldn't have it, or at least it'd be a little bit more challenging to get there. That's an interesting item that has started to emerge of, hey, that's a way to be able to provide access. The other answer that I would give to your question is, again, I think we need to be adaptable and have a hybrid approach. And we've seen that pendulum swing. And I shared that even in my story, right? Pre-COVID, everything's got to be in person. COVID happened for good reasons. Everything was virtual. Can we find that middle ground? Because for some of us, we might learn a little bit better being in person.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's the beauty of technology. And I think the pandemic accelerated some progression in making it. I mean, having the internet now is no longer a nice to have, it's a have to have, right? And so I think then now technology has caught up, and not only to access materials, but it has made our global world very small. I mean, you mentioned earlier, we're on opposite ends of the coast in the US having this conversation about inclusive communities. I mean, that's pretty cool to be able to leverage technology. And I have many friends all over the country that I'm able to use technology and a number of different platforms to stay connected to that community, to my events friends or community friends who are running these brainstorming ideas. I mean, there's so many subgroups that have popped up on Facebook and LinkedIn, and you run the gamut of how we're engaging with each other. It looks very different, I think, than we did probably 3 years ago.
Truth, without question.
So technology can be good, and it can also be a hindrance sometimes too. And I think one of the things you said earlier kind of keeps resonating in my brain was giving the grace and space. Yes. And meeting people on the learning paths where they want to. I have some people I work with that respond well to video and like audio type of engagement. And then I have some people I work with that really absorb information on text and blogs and reading as opposed to watching and listening. So I think that just goes to how we're approaching each other and learning and, meeting people where they want to be met.
Right, without question. And I think that's part of the conversation, for example, even with remote and flex work schedules, for example, and, being able to hold that space and grace to acknowledge that, for example, that we do have some professionals that they may work best 9 to 5 in the office, physical location, and maybe it's a structural routine, whatever the case may be. For them, that's how they excel. And that's great. Create those opportunities. For some others, being virtual, being able to be in their own space, maybe it's even noise and less distractions. For some, not all, when you're virtual at home, that provides them with the best opportunity to be their most productive, empowered, all those different things. And that's the work sometimes of a DEI officer, is to be able to create those conversations, to acknowledge that we have that variance. That's part of the inclusive culture we're looking to develop, is to honor all of those different ways in which we can do our work as professionals.
Yeah, I love that. So what are some of the goals for you or your organization around community engagement? And I think I'm really thinking on that engagement piece, because as you just mentioned, so much of our work is hybrid now. Some people have an office, some people don't. I work fully remote. So I don't necessarily see a lot of my colleagues in person. And so engagement looks very different to me than, say, my colleagues, in the DC area that go to an office every single day. So what are you guys doing with this very flexible model to allow people to thrive in their best environment? How does that lend to then a bigger conversation around community engagement and keeping them engaged with the organization and their colleagues?
That is a really good question. And I think we'll first start by acknowledging that diversity, equity, and inclusion here is seen as a part of our imperatives, right? Our strategies, our main overarching goals for the company, and in particular, it's imperative 5, a purpose-driven team, right? And purpose, in my opinion, and in my background and experiences as an educator, for me to find a purpose in the work that I do, I need to feel valued and supported and welcomed in the community in which I'm a part of, the organization that I'm a part of. And that's where those items come together so nicely with respect to DEI. So one of the items that we mobilized on, and this started before my arrival at the company last year, is the creation of employee resource groups. And that is a space, especially for, and this is well documented, right? Historically excluded communities of color, LGBTQ plus, for example, are often the only in their organizations and their departments and kind of everything in between. So ERGs help to create those spaces of community, right? To be able to come together with folks like yourself and build those relationships that we know are so important. And that can occur in person and virtually as well, right? We can build those relations just here on the screen, just with the smile and the clap and the kudos of, hey, you're doing really good work, keep it going. And there's more to do, but that has been kind of a step one of let's build those communities so that, again, everyone feels that they belong, they're welcomed, and then, of course, are empowered to be their best professionals that they can in the company.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one thing I heard someone say to me recently about, digital communities, that it gives everyone an opportunity to have a seat at the table. Now, what they choose to do with their voice when they have that seat, but it creates a little bit more equitable play where everyone has that opportunity to participate in the conversation should they want to do that. So I think that's fantastic.
That's a great point. And and that's where the work even lives too, is talking about, you might have a seat at the table, but what might prevent your ability to have that voice? It's not always the individual, it might be the environment. And that's where the work lives.
Oh, for sure. There's a whole 2.0 conversation around what do you do with your voice once you have the seat at the table? Because to your point, I've been invited to many things in the past where I was so excited, like I finally got included. I'm finally in the community. I'm part of the group. And then I got there and I was like, oh, this is not a safe place for me to say the things that I want to. It's not an inclusive environment, for me to speak up or speak my mind. Even though I was part of it, I chose not to participate, really, frankly. So that's a whole nother topic for another day.
Right.
But I think it does lend to some of this that, one of the good things, the silver lining, if there is one to come out of the pandemic, is using and leveraging technologies to give, people that space and inviting them to the table, and then having a much more diverse and inclusive point of view to make better decisions for your organization, your group, whatever it might be.
Right.
Awesome. Well, we have just a few minutes left, so I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
Last couple thoughts. So we work with a lot of groups here at Juno that are diving into community for the very first time. And a lot of them are thinking about DEI initiatives and how that plays into community. So if there was one piece of advice that you would give to a group thinking about diving into digital communities, digital engagement, and how that plays into DEI initiatives, what would you say? Where do they start?
The first place that I think one would start is, again, I think it's very important for an organization, and I use that term very broadly, right? Define what DEI means to you. It's important to have shared understanding so we do not have misunderstandings. What is diversity? For us, diversity is the uniquenesses that we all have, identities, backgrounds, experience. Great. Okay. Now we know that is what diversity means, and then we can start to pull out some objectives from there, for example. So we can say, this is diversity, and then when we look at our organization, we see that we are not very diverse when we look at XYZ identities. Okay, well, now we have some goals to be more diverse in those spaces. And then we can start asking the questions of what activities do we partake in to create belonging, welcomingness. That's the inclusion piece. And those are two different activities.
Yeah.
One is recruitment. How do we engage and bring people in? Inclusion is, how do we keep you? What is the environment like? It's not just the individual that might cause the disconnect. It might be the environment. Sometimes it's the environment more than the individual, right? But you start there. And the spirit of that work is grounded in the acknowledgement that, and people, I'm going to make a statement here. Some folks are not comfortable with the acknowledgement that we're not the same. I'm not I need some time maybe to think a little bit more about where that's coming from. I think some of it might be grounded in melting pot and, Americana and things of that sort. But as, a colleague of mine shared, Scott, we are all unique. She kept going back to the fingerprint. And that's not to create a power dynamic of any way. No, it's just to honor that we all have our own story. And we want to be able to create environments that honors that. And I don't want to treat you the same way that I treat everybody else that I meet throughout the day, because that's not honoring you. And that's where the opportunities live. And I think when we answer those two questions, I think that really helps us in making sure that the commitment is sustainable.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely love that. And I think even when we're talking about diversity, some of it's diversity of thought and extroverts versus introverts, and how I like to, it's great getting invited to the party, but then what do I do when I'm there? As an introverted person, I'm going to behave very differently at the party than you would. And, that's what makes it so fabulous, is that we're all so different and have so many opportunities to learn from each other and experience different things and have a little bit more empathy for each other, because, our whole life experiences are all different. No one has the same at all.
Right. Without question.
So one final thought from you: if there would be one main point you want to make about inclusive communities, what would that be?
My main point is coming from the national narrative right now around DEI. And I think we kind of just answered this with the previous question, and it's to not fear it. Do not fear the work. Do not fear the conversation around inclusive communities, inclusive digital communities, inclusive communities, period. Because it's all, the work is in the spirit of, again, building better connections with each other. And to recognize that for some, maybe you don't, you want that private, and that's okay. That's part of the conversation as well, right? But it's to acknowledge that for some members of our community, we maybe have not created those pathways, those spaces for you to participate in the ways in which we have for others. And we want to do better at that. That's what this work is all about. And in doing so, we might find that there are structural inequities and things of that sort that we need to modify to help get rid of those barriers. But at the end of the day, it's all about access so we can all succeed. And hopefully when we lean into that, that's where, again, the work is sustainable. We all see ourselves in the work, and it helps bring us together.
I absolutely love that. I think that's a great place to end the conversation. I think there's tons of nuggets to take away, and, kind of leaning into the uncomfortable. Some of this work can be hard to talk about and hard to tackle. And I think you gave our audience, some great tips on just where to start, like where to even start these conversations, with your own organizations or groups, associations, whatever that community, looks like for them. Great. So anyway, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. We had a great conversation. Again, masterclass in 20, 30 minutes here on DE&I, and really just wanted to thank you. Any closing thoughts, comments before we wrap up?
Just that, again, I enjoyed the conversation, and again, don't shy away from the opportunities to learn a little bit more about each other. And thank you so much for the time today.
Well, thank you, Scott, for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you at our next podcast recording. Thanks, Scott. I hope you have a good one.
You too. Thanks.
See ya.
Thank you for joining us. Let this story inspire you to the serious work needed to build an inclusive digital community that makes a difference for your network and your brand. For more conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the show at junolive.com/podcast. Don't forget to share this show with your network so we can all learn from each other how to build inclusive communities. We'll be talking more about this episode on LinkedIn, where you'll find us under Juno Live. See you on the next episode.